He almost canceled twice. The first time was the morning she texted, a Saturday in November, a message that said simply, "When you have a chance, there are still a few boxes of your things here. I'd like to clear the space before the new year." He'd read it standing in his kitchen, holding coffee that was getting cold, and felt the thing he always felt when contact came from that direction. Not quite avoidance, not quite dread. Something more like the specific reluctance of a person who prefers not to look at certain things. He'd typed, "Sure, I'll come this week," and sent it before he could think too hard about it. The second time was Wednesday evening when he was getting ready to drive over Thursday morning. He'd told himself he might be coming down with something. He'd stood in his bathroom looking at himself in the mirror for a moment. A man who was 51 years old and recently not sick at all. And then he'd gone to bed. He drove over on Thursday morning. His name was David. He lived in an apartment in a suburb of Cleveland, 22 minutes from the house that had been his and Laura's for 11 years and was now just Laura's, purchased from him in the settlement, which had been handled with the specific efficiency of two people who have stopped fighting about anything because they've stopped caring enough to fight. The settlement had happened 18 months ago. The divorce had been final for 14. He'd been back to the house once, right after the settlement, to pick up larger things. The second set of visits, the boxes, had been planned several times and postponed several times, which neither of them had discussed, which was its own small pattern consistent with every other small pattern that had characterized the end of their marriage. He parked in the driveway. The house looked maintained. Laura was meticulous about the yard, always had been, and the garden was put to bed for winter in that careful way she had, everything deliberate, nothing accidental. He sat in the car for a moment, looking at the front door, the particular dark green of it that they'd picked together 12 years ago from a paint swatch at the hardware store. He hadn't picked the color. He'd approved it. There was a difference that hadn't seemed important at the time. She let him in before he knocked. She'd seen his car, he assumed, the driveway being visible from the kitchen window where she'd apparently been. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He stepped inside. The house smelled the same, which was disorienting in the specific way that smell always is, neutral for a moment, and then not neutral at all. "Thanks for doing this." "It needed to happen," she said. "Coffee?" "Sure." They went to the kitchen, which was as she'd made it in the years since he'd left. A few things moved, a few things different, but fundamentally the kitchen he'd eaten breakfast in for 11 years, just inhabited differently now. She poured coffee and set it in front of him and didn't sit, leaning against the counter instead with her own cup. She looked fine. He'd been unsure what he'd find, and he found fine. Laura was 48 and had always been one of those people whose composure registered as its own kind of information, who didn't show things on the surface in ways that were easy to read. He'd spent 11 years at a middling level of certainty about what she was thinking, which had seemed like a feature early on. He liked that she wasn't needy, wasn't exhausting, and had later come to feel like a mirror he'd been standing too close to. "Boxes are in the spare room," she said. "I did go through them. I hope that's okay. I pulled out the things that were yours specifically and left the rest." "Of course. Thank you." "There are 3, I think. Maybe 4. She paused. "Some of the books might be mixed up. I wasn't always sure what was whose." "That's fine." They talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, his drive, the weather, something he couldn't really track because he was doing it on half his attention, while the other half adjusted to being back in the kitchen. He'd thought about this visit, off and on, in the way you think about things you keep deferring, and he'd thought it would feel like relief once it was finally happening. It felt, instead, like being very awake in a space that had previously allowed him to be somewhat asleep. He finished the coffee, and she walked into the spare room. There were 4 boxes, neat and labeled in Laura's handwriting. His name, and then a brief description. Office things, books, miscellaneous. The 4th one said simply, other and had tape across the top that had been applied and then wasn't quite sealed. He noticed that one. "I'll bring the car around to the side door," she said. "It'll be easier to carry them out." She left him with the boxes. He looked at the room. It had been his office when he lived here. The desk was gone. She'd taken it as part of the furniture division, something practical, and it was now a room that was becoming something else, in the process of being remade. There was a half-assembled bookshelf against one wall, new paint swatches on another, the evidence of someone deciding what to do with newly available space. He bent to check the 4 boxes. He moved the first 2 closer to the door. Books felt heavy and familiar, and picked up the third, which rattled slightly with what sounded like office supplies. He opened the 4th box. He'd intended to just verify the contents. He wasn't sure why the tape wasn't sealed. Some instinct, maybe, or just a slight gap in it, the corner lifted. Inside were things he hadn't expected to find together. His old watch, the first one he'd bought himself at 25, which he'd thought was lost years ago. A folded program from a concert they'd gone to early in the relationship. He could remember the night. The parking situation had been a disaster, and they'd walked 3 blocks in the rain and laughed about it. And he hadn't thought about that evening in years. A photograph he'd taken of Laura in their first apartment, printed on physical paper, the kind you got developed, from a time before everything existed only on a phone. She was looking at something out of frame and didn't know she was being photographed, and had the expression of a person who is entirely at ease. And she looked 29 years old, and she was 29 years old. And underneath the photograph, a rubber band around a small stack of papers. He picked them up. They were notes. His handwriting, on the torn edges of things, the back of receipts, small squares of notebook paper, the corner of an envelope. He'd left them for her in the early years. He remembered the habit, vaguely, the way you remember things that no longer feel like you. He'd written small things, practical things mostly. Coffee's on, left early, dinner tonight, I'll cook. But also other things, small observations, the kind of note you leave for someone when you're thinking about them and they're not there. "You looked particularly yourself this morning. I notice I'm thinking about you at random intervals today. Found this article about that thing you mentioned." Tearing it out. There were maybe 20 notes. He stood in the spare room of his former house looking at them. He'd stopped leaving notes. He knew this without examining it. It was part of a general pattern of stopping that he'd been aware of in the abstract, without letting himself look at directly. The notes had stopped when? He tried to locate it. Early years, yes. Middle years, less. Late years, nothing. He couldn't remember the last time he'd written something for Laura that wasn't functional. He'd told himself, when the marriage was ending and in the period after, that he'd simply grown tired, that the warmth had gone, the way it goes, the way people said it goes, when they were trying to explain the inexplicable erosion of what had once been real. He'd framed it that way to himself, to the friends he'd told, to the version of the story he'd been living in. We grew apart. It happens. We were good together once, and then we just weren't. It was a comfortable frame. It implied no particular failure of character, no specific error, just the neutral passage of time and change. He'd believed it mostly. He'd gone to sleep believing it for 14 months. He stood with the notes and the photograph and the watch he'd thought was lost, and looked at the evidence of who he'd been and thought, when did I decide to stop? Not the marriage. Before that, when had he decided? And it was a decision. He could see that now. Not a fading, but a choosing. When had he decided that what Laura needed from him was not worth providing? He didn't say it that harshly in his head. He said it in the softer versions. I got tired. I got consumed with work. The conversations got repetitive. She wanted more than I had. All of these things were true. None of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was something closer to, He had been present in this marriage when it was easy, and absent when it wasn't. And the absence had been continuous and quiet, and he'd had a very good vocabulary for explaining it as something other than what it was. Laura came to the door of the spare room. "Ready to start carrying?" she asked. Then she saw his face. She looked at the box. "Oh," she said. "I didn't know you kept these," he said. "I almost didn't include them." She leaned against the door frame. "I almost threw them out when I was going through things. But they're yours, technically." He looked at the notes. "I don't know that they are." She was quiet for a moment. "I hadn't looked at them in a long time," he said. I'd forgotten I was capable of this. This kind of—" He stopped. Laura said nothing. She had the expression she usually had when something real was happening. Not closed, not guarded, just waiting to see where it went. He'd experienced this expression as unhelpfulness during the marriage, which he now understood was not what it was. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "Why did you keep them? Really?" She looked at the notes in his hand for a moment. "Because they were proof," she said. "Not for anything in particular, not evidence for an argument, just—" She stopped. "On the hard days, I used to take them out and look at them, to prove to myself that it had been real, that I hadn't invented it." He absorbed this. "You had to prove it to yourself?" he asked. "Toward the end, yeah." She said it simply. You were there, technically. You came home, you were physically present, you answered questions when I asked them, but you weren't there. And I kept thinking it was something I was doing wrong, that I was asking too much, or the wrong things, or—" She paused. "The notes were from when you'd been there. I used them to remember that version of you existed." He put the notes down carefully on the top of the box. He'd been expecting, when he'd thought about this visit in any detail, that there might be a version of this conversation that was accusatory, that the notes might become evidence in a case being built against him. He'd been prepared, in the distant contingency planning way he prepared for most things, to receive that and respond to it. What he hadn't been prepared for was this, her quietness, her lack of anger, the simple factual quality with which she described what had happened. She wasn't prosecuting. She was just stating what had been true, which was somehow worse. Or not worse, but more. Here's the thing about being a person who disappears quietly. The person left behind doesn't get a fight to point to. They just get the absence. And the absence is hard to name, which makes it harder to defend against. If you know either side of this, stay with the story. And subscribe if this channel is where you come for things that feel true. "I don't think I knew I was doing it," he said. He said it not as a defense, but because it was true and also, he understood, insufficient. "I know," she said. I know it doesn't make it better." She wasn't saying it sharply. "David, I'm not angry at you. I was angry for a long time, and I'm not anymore." She looked at the room, at the paint swatches on the wall, at the half-assembled bookshelf. "I'm building something here. That's what I'm doing now. I'm not living in what happened." She looked back at him. "But you asked." "Yeah," he said. "I did." He picked up one of the notes. The handwriting was his, but felt foreign. The looseness of it, the ease. A man writing something quickly because the thought was right there and he wanted to give it to someone. He didn't write like that anymore. He didn't think like that anymore. He wasn't sure when the thinking had changed, or whether the thinking had caused the writing to stop, or the stopping of the writing had changed the thinking. "What would you have needed?" he asked. "In the last few years, what would have—" "David, I know it's too late. I know that. I'm asking because—" He stopped. "Because what?" Because he was 51 and living in an apartment and about to carry boxes of his old life to his car, and he wanted to understand what he'd done, specifically, not as a general failure, but as a specific one, so that he would have the correct information for whatever came next. "You could have shown up," she said. "Not in big ways. We didn't need grand gestures. You could have just—" She looked at the notes. "You could have still been the person who left the notes." She paused. "Not the notes specifically, but whatever they meant. The paying attention, the letting me know you were thinking about me." She looked at him. "That stopped. It stopped a long time before we did." He knew this. He knew it standing there. He'd known it for a while, at the depth that things are known when you haven't let them rise to the surface. "I told myself I was tired," he said. "I know. I was tired." "I know you were. I was too." She looked at the window. Tired is real, but tired isn't. Tired doesn't mean you stop. You can be tired and still be present. You chose not to be present. She said it without cruelty, just precision. "I think you know that." He did know that. He'd known it arriving and was knowing it more specifically now. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "Not for the end of the marriage," he said. I think we were wrong for each other in some ways that were real. I'm not sorry for the end." He paused. "I'm sorry for disappearing inside it, for a long time before the end, for making you keep notes to prove to yourself that it had been real." He stopped. "It was real. I want you to know that. I was real at the beginning. And then I made a series of choices to be less real, and I told myself it was happening to me instead of that I was doing it, and He stopped again. "I'm sorry." Laura looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just receiving it. They carried the boxes to his car. She held the door while he moved them out, and they did it efficiently. Two people who'd moved furniture together for years and had the physical vocabulary of it still. 3 boxes in the trunk, the 4th on the back seat. He didn't take the notes out of the 4th box. He left them there. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do with them. At his car, she said, "I hope things are good for you, David. I mean that." He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't looked in years, the way he'd stopped looking, which was itself part of what the notes were evidence of. "They're okay," he said. "Getting better, I think." He paused. I think I've been doing the same thing in my life that I did in the marriage, and I'm trying to stop." She nodded once. "Good. I think I owe some people clearer versions of myself." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Yeah," she said. "I think you probably do." He drove back to his apartment. He sat in the parking garage for a while before going up, the car still running, the 4th box on the back seat, the notes inside it in their rubber band. He thought about what he was going to do differently. He tried to make it concrete because he was suspicious of general resolutions, which were easy to make and difficult to enforce and tended to dissolve in the face of actual situations. He thought about the specific way absence worked in him, the pulling back when things got effortful, the reclassifying of, "I don't want to deal with this," as, "I'm too tired for this." The belief, somewhere underneath his operating behavior, that presence was optional when it wasn't comfortable. It wasn't an unfixable thing. He didn't think it was unfixable, but it required watching, the way any long habit requires watching. Not assuming you've changed because you've decided to, but checking, regularly, whether you've actually shown up. He turned off the car. He took the notes out of the 4th box before carrying anything upstairs. He didn't take them out to read them. He'd read them. He didn't need to read them again. He took them out because he wanted them somewhere he could see them. Not as self-punishment, as information. He put them on his kitchen counter, still in their rubber band, next to the coffee maker, which was the thing he looked at most often in the morning. In the mornings after that, he saw them. Some mornings he thought about Laura, and the house, and the paint swatches, and her face at the door of the spare room, quietly receiving an apology she'd long since stopped expecting. Some mornings he thought about whoever else was in his life, people he'd been doing the same thing to in smaller ways, the managed distances, the strategic absences, and what it would mean to be actually there. He started being there. Not perfectly, not transformed overnight into the version of himself he'd been at 32, leaving notes because the thought was right there and someone was worth giving it to. But differently. More awake in the room, more willing to stay when staying was effort. He texted a friend he'd been keeping at a managed distance and made actual plans that he followed through on. He called his sister, who he'd spoken to functionally for years, logistics, holidays, the surface of things, and asked how she was in a way that invited a real answer. And she gave him one, and they talked for an hour, and she said at the end, "This is nice. We should do this more." "Yeah," he said. "We should." He meant it. He stayed in the meaning of it, which was different from the intention alone. The notes stayed on the kitchen counter until February, when he moved them to a drawer. Not gone, just not in the daily eyeline. He felt he'd absorbed what they were trying to tell him. He didn't need the reminder in the same way. What he needed now was the practice, which was slower and more repetitive and less dramatic than the realization had been, and which was also the only way it became real. He thought about Laura sometimes. Not with the specific longing of the early months after the divorce. That had resolved, as it does, into something flatter and less urgent. He thought about her with the particular regard you have for someone who showed you something true about yourself without asking for anything in return for the showing. She'd been clear and direct, and had not performed the anger she'd long since stopped feeling, and he'd left her house with the boxes and a clearer picture of himself than he'd arrived with. He was going to do something with the picture. That was the only answer worth giving. He started a note, not for anyone specific, just a habit he was rebuilding, the practice of it, the writing down of small things because someone is worth the writing. He didn't know yet who it was for. Maybe it would become clear. Maybe he would become, again, the kind of person who knew when a thought was worth giving to someone and gave it. He left it on his counter next to the coffee maker. A small square of paper, his handwriting, the specific looseness of it. A man writing something because the thought was right there. He went to work. The note was there when he got home. He picked it up and read it and thought, "Yes, that's right. That's what I meant." And he wrote a second one. If this story landed somewhere close, if you recognized the quiet version of being gone or being left, leave a word in the comments. Not a resolution, just the acknowledgement. Sometimes that's enough. Take care of yourselves.